Welcome to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises, the program where we take an intergenerational approach to the book of Revelation. I'm Jon Paulien. I'm a professor of religion at Loma Linda University. With us is Iris Mamier, who is a professor of nursing at Loma Linda University. And to her left is Gustavo Assis, who is completing his work, a PhD in Old Testament at Boston College. And to his left is Guillermo Borda, who is working on his dissertation for New Testament at Andrews University, and particularly Book of Revelation. But as you know, Book of Revelation is very interested in the Old Testament, and that's why we have a specialist ready to help us out with some of those fine points as we go along.
I wish for this chapter I had many answers.
Yes, well, this chapter, of course, perhaps it will be your insights that help us to put it together, because we are taking on the middle part of Revelation 17, which many scholars feel is the most difficult passage in the Bible to understand. It wouldn't be my first choice, but it's definitely in the top 5. Now, Iris, we've been missing you here the last few sessions, and I think you were on a mission somewhere far away. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we all wear many hats, and sometimes one role takes precedence over another. I had a family emergency. My father had a fall in Germany, and I was grateful that I could use online teaching modes and be stabilizing the situation at home and work at night when the U.S. California is awake. So that worked out very well, and I was grateful that.
And your father lives in
north of Berlin.
North of Berlin, in Germany. All right.
Yeah.
Well, glad to have you back, and
Thank you.
Looking forward to tackling together this incredible passage. So, Gustavo, why don't you read verse 7 of Revelation 17, and we invite our audience to join in reading that.
All right, so it reads, "But the angel said to me, 'Why do you marvel? I'll tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast, with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her.'"
All right, so this verse is like a transition between the vision in verses 1 to 6, particularly 3 to 6, and then an explanation from an angel. This is typical. You see it in the book of Daniel all the time. Chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8, and so on. You have a vision and then an explanation by an angel to the prophet. So here the angel comes and says, "I will explain to you" what? "The mystery of the woman," or in the vision there was a woman, a prostitute, "and of the beast that she rides." All right, so there's a woman, there's a beast, that was in verse 3, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. All right, so the rest of this chapter is an angelic explanation to John of what he has just seen, the woman sitting on the beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. And so verse 8, we will see, and if you were to read it in the Greek, you could see this very clearly. It says, the beast which you saw, the woman which you saw, the waters which you saw. It's sort of going through the vision and explaining things. So the explanation of the beast starts in verse 8. Then come the 7 heads, and they're explained in verses 9 to 10. Then the heads and the beast together in verse 11. Then come the 10 horns, and they're explained in verses 12 to 14. And then in verse 15 is the waters that the woman was originally sitting on. And then you get back to the 10 horns in verses 16 and 17. And finally, at the very end, you get to the woman in verse 18. But she continues to be the focus in a different form through all chapter 18. So he saved the longest explanation for last. And I think you could easily perhaps break the chapter between verses 17 and 18, because that kind of fits. But it also fits chapter 17. So this is what I call a duo-directional text. it looks both ways. Verse 18 looks forward to Babylon, the city, and its destruction. It also looks back on the vision at the beginning of this chapter. So, Guillermo, before we got started, you said you had questions for me. Is that right?
I mean, this is, you pointed out that this is a challenging text. And indeed, it is a challenging text. It seems that the deeper we go, then the deeper the questions get as well, right? And also, it challenges our sense of a simplistic understanding. Right? And you've shared also in the past that, in experiences with students as well, you found that people can find it challenging to go through this passage. I think that one good framing thing for this is how to compare the aspects that are clear and the aspects that are not so clear to us, right? And insofar as the emphasis and insofar as how the book is to be used as well, right?
Well, I think one thing that is clear is that you have, the woman and the beast. You have the prostitute and the waters. They seem to be parallel entities. And then both of these go all the way through the chapter. So it's evil kind of in two different forms. One of them summed up in Babylon and the other one summed up in the beast. So we will dig a little bit deeper into all of that.
I have a question for you.
All right.
You have studied Revelation for decades. Has your understanding of this chapter changed?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I would honestly say when it comes to the seven trumpets, I think I was more sure of what it meant before I went deep into it. And now, 40 years later, I'm a little less certain about what the trumpets are all about than before. That's a really, really tough one. That might be my number one, or Daniel 11 would be my most difficult passages. But chapter 17 has actually become a little clearer because there's like 12.5 symbols in here. And if you're trying to find some sort of parallel to those symbols, you quickly get twisted into a ball. And when I realized that there's a series of symbols related to Babylon and another series related to the beast, and that the two of them are in a relationship with each other, it started to come together. It was the idea that Babylon represents a worldwide alliance of religion at the end of time, and the beast represents a worldwide alliance of secular power, a united nations, if you will. And then you have the saints. So you have three alliances. The saints are the third one, or as it says in verse 14 here, the called, chosen, and faithful. So you have these three alliances at the end of time. Two of them against the people of God, who are, on the outside. They are not appreciated. They are hunted down. They are being persecuted, etc. So for me, it was about 30 years ago when I first saw, hey, look at verse 8. It says there, the inhabitants of the earth, whose name's written in the book of life, will be astonished. No, that's not it. Verse 9, this is what I want you to see. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. So right there, you've got 3 different symbols that you could easily chase in different directions, but they're all the same thing, you see? And then the prostitute of verse 1 is the woman of verse 3, is the Babylon of verse 5. So there you have a series of symbols on that side. You have the waters representing nations. You have the beast representing nations. You have the kings clearly representing nations, etc. Mountains are often a symbol of nations in the Old Testament. So when I saw that the 2 lines of symbols were multiple ways of saying the same thing, it got a lot simpler. But let me tell you what the real problem is. Okay, let's go to verse 8. Maybe Iris, if you'd read that for us. This is where everything goes wrong for most people.
Okay. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, yet will come.
All right, so twice here it says, the beast was, is not, and will return in some form. It's repeated again in verse 11. The beast who once was and now is not is an eighth king. He belongs to the seven and is going to his destruction. So you have this three-part thing several times. Now here's the challenge. Explanations of prophecy come to the prophet in the prophet's time and place. So you're telling John, the beast is not. But then in verse 10, 5 are fallen, 1 is. So one of the heads of the beast is now, but the beast is not. You see the problem? So what's going on here? Does this beast exist in John's day or doesn't it? Does the head exist or doesn't it? I mean, any way that people go to try to figure out how you reconcile those two facts, it twists you into a ball. So I'll toss that out. Anybody have a solution? Because you see, I'll tell you what two big alternatives are, at least in the community that I'm part of, community of scholars, Seventh-day Adventist scholars. Some would say, well, you know, the sixth head is now, that's got to be Rome of John's day. All right? But then others say, yeah, but the beast is not. And Rome was definitely there. So he can't be talking about John's day. It must be some later time when the beast is not, and then they end up in the 19th century where the Pope was dethroned and it was the papal states were not reestablished until 1929. So they say that must be the is not time. You see. So it kind of, you know, which way do you go?
Yeah.
All right, Guilherme, I know, has a solution to
No,
that.
well,
Or he thinks he does.
no, I don't. You know, I come to this with great humility. But what I would suggest is also an important framing attitude for the discussion is that mainly the challenge is in the details rather than in the bigger picture. Right? The bigger picture that you were suggesting a way of putting it together earlier, and that we have been presenting in previous episodes, that there will be this anti-Christian alliance in the end time. There will be this religious side, there will be this political side, and that they will fight against the people of God, and it will be an oppressive effort. That is clear. And one important thing is that when we go to a text like this and we cannot make sense of certain details, that we do not miss the clear picture. Because even a text that we don't have all the answers for all the details, we should still be able to allow it to inform how we live today as for its big picture. Because the main point for us today with this text is today to live in a way that is faithful to Jesus, that, you know, basically to seek to be as those that will be faithful at that time. That's the point, right? To allow God to work in me both to will and to do, to be faithful to Him, that I live as one who is among the called, chosen, and faithful. That if I come
live today so that you can survive then.
Well, in a sense that if I am called to live in that time when it does happen, that I will be among the called, chosen, and faithful. But I am to be among the chosen and faithful today as well, right? Because it's not only about the future, right? It's being faithful today. And if it happens that I live through that time, that I will not join the side of the alliances of evil, of the religious and political alliances on the evil side. And although it might seem, well, but you're simplifying it too much, but interestingly enough, that's the main point of the chapter, is to instill faithfulness to Jesus. As simple as it sounds, in the midst of a complicated articulation thing here, the main point of the book in general is not to point out the different details of history. That's not the main thing. Because there will be people who receive the mark of the beast, that will join the side of the beast, that knew a lot about the timeline of the prophecy. And there might be people that knew hardly anything that will be faithful. And so in terms of like doing all this, the timeline and all of that. So at the end, what is the core thing, right? I think this is an important thing so we don't despair in the face of our limited understanding, right? But, and also it's something that can help us when we have a community of believers that thinks differently, but that we have that core that unites us, which happens to be the most important point. I think to me, I find this to be a helpful framing attitude for the discussion, right? That we don't lose sight of the main point of the book, which is to instill faithfulness to Jesus. Now, as far as these challenges of the beast is not and is, I wonder, what you would say, I toss it back to you in terms of how we've seen in chapter 13 with the beast there, that it has aspects of powers that existed in the past. Because the beast that comes out of the sea, it combines features of all four of the beasts that Daniel sees coming out of the sea. And these are not powers that were in existence at the time of John. He's depicting something as something for the future from his perspective, but it has features from the past. So I wonder if maybe that can possibly help with this situation here of the is not, but then the is at the same time, if it has anything to do with the fact that you have, I think in writing, the word you use is the pedigree of the power, right? I wonder if that can help anyhow with this challenge.
All right, I think I interrupted you earlier, Gustavo. You had a point you wanted to make.
I was going in the same direction that Guilherme was going with the whole idea of the big picture. And the big picture that I like to keep in mind when I read a text like this is to see the kind of God that I follow, that I worship. It is a God that does not keep things secret. He reveals secrets. He reveals the mystery. Sends an angel to do that job. And that is a very strong language in the book of Daniel. Daniel loves the word of mystery. And the phrase that is used in Daniel repeatedly is to uncover a mystery, something that was hidden. It is now brought to light. Yeah. So the kind of God that we worship likes to bring things to the light, to the fore, to show to people. And when something is complex, to John here, he is sending one of his messengers, one of his angels, to show him. And we didn't read that verse in verse 9, but it talks about wisdom, which is also something that God gives to his children. Whoever is in need, ask for wisdom.
I plan to get back to you on that one.
Yeah. All right. Well, but it is just, that is a part of the big picture that I want you to keep in mind when I read a text like this. I don't know all the details. I don't have explanation for all the details, but I know that the God that we serve is revealed. The name of the book is Revelation, so it is disclosing, revealing.
So you have a God that reveals by sending a vision that's difficult to understand, and then an explanation that's more difficult to understand than the vision.
That is another way to frame the conversation. Maybe it made sense to John, because he's shocked, and that language of being shocked, astonished. I remember, for example, Ezekiel chapter 3, after the initial vision of the wheels within the wheels and the four creatures, he's also in awe. He's astonished for 7 days until he gets another command to go to a valley and receives another vision. And so there is a shock there. There's an astonishment. but then is remedied by the sending of the angel to give an explanation. Maybe it made sense to John. I don't know. He didn't have a back and forth, right, with the angel.
Any thoughts in your mind, Iris? Now you're going to come at it from a completely different angle. I'm curious what comes to your mind as you run to something like this.
I think it's interesting, you know, when you first start Revelation 1, that it talks there in verse 4 about a God who was, who is to come, who is, who was, and who is to come. And it always struck me, you know, why would God or Jesus introduce himself as the one who is, who was, and who is to come? Mm-hmm. But here in chapter 17, we have a different power that is not like, and yet there are points of commonality in the sense that the temporal aspect plays a role. And all of a sudden, it alerted me, you know, the reliability, the continuity of God. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, we have had all sorts of ideas that God walked off. He created us and then he didn't care anymore. He just walked off and disappeared, and he will probably look at our mess and never bother to even come back. No, this God is, was, and will come back. But that power here, counterfeit power, is assuming a space, but it's not reliable, and it is something that seems to occupy that space that belongs to God.
See, I warned you guys, this nursing professor is going to pull something out of the Bible you never saw before. And, you know, it's like you're reading my mind. That's the solution that I've been looking for all these years, exactly what you were just saying. And it only really sunk into me just a couple of months ago. This was and is not, and yet is. That's a parody of chapter 1. The one who is and was and is to come. Mm-hmm. And it's repeated 3 times. You have the unholy Trinity, you have the true Trinity. So 3 times this beast is claiming for itself the prerogatives of God alone. And for me, that means that this is not a temporal thing. It isn't in chapter 1. It isn't like God, you know, was, is not, you know, was and is to come. So it isn't so much about time, you know, or a sequence of time. It's a way of God identifying who he is. And here you have a power that is seeking to claim the prerogatives of God. But it does it in a twisted way. Was and is not, and yet is. Was and is not and is yet to come, etc. And will go into perdition, you see. So you look at that whole thing, it's a twisted parody of who God is. And if that's the case, suddenly this makes sense, because I think, Gustavo, you would agree that whenever in Daniel the prophet gets an explanation, it's got to make sense in his time and place.
Yes. Yes.
Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. After you comes somebody else. He's rooted in Nebuchadnezzar's time. And
Same in chapter
if that is
7.
what's happening here, then that's the time, place. And everything's got to be interpreted from that point of view. So we are living in the time of the 6th head. We'll get to that in just a moment. But we're living in the time of the 6th head. That's John's day. It's the time of Rome, you see. But chapter 17 is about John's future. And I think that's a governing center to all of this.
I have a question.
Because it's crucial to what you do with the 7 heads in just a little bit, where you put that 6th head. You see, if the 6th head is John's day, then you've got only 2 more cycles to go. If the 6th head is at some future time, then all the other heads can be all kinds of things, you see. So it's really a critical thing. And the contradiction between these two, if taken temporally, is you can't get past it, you know. But if that's not a temporal designation, just was and is not and yet is just this self-identification of the beast, that means the cosmic conflict is rooted here. Just like Daniel 10, you got powers that Satan is working with, and that God's angels are also working with, trying to bring out the proper outcome. And chapter 17 takes us in the end to the triumph of God's way over all these other options. So,
a parenthesis here. Do we have, is that remind me, how common is the self-introduction of God as I am in the book of Revelation compared to...
it's 4 times, I think.
Okay, but you have more in the Gospel of John than in Revelation, if I'm correct.
Not in exactly the same way. I think Revelation is kind of unique in that. The was and is to come is twice.
Yeah.
Chapter 1 and chapter 4. And then twice it's the one who was and is. But that's the end time God. The is to come has already come. So he was and he is.
I'm asking because it might be, I don't know, I haven't seen this in the literature, an interpretation of the name of God in Exodus 3. Because in Exodus 3, how we translate I am what I am, Hebrew verb tenses is very complex. You can use the same form for past, for present, and for future. So it might be an unpack of the name that John is alluding when he uses that phrase in chapter 1, which the beast is doing the parody in chapter 17.
I love that, Gustavo. I think you're absolutely on track. And I think scholars have noticed that in chapter 1. I'm not sure anybody's seen it in chapter 17, so this is a prophetic surprise, okay? But in Exodus, I am who I am. Many scholars have said that the Greek of chapter 1, the one who is and was and is to come, is modeled on the Septuagint of Exodus 3. So you're taking that self-description of God and reframing it here in Revelation. And then you get to chapter 17 and you discover the whole issue is about the character of God, what he is like, who he is, who is the true God, etc. And so with that in mind, folk, I think we had our prophetic surprise for today, the idea of bringing the character of God into chapter 17. Well, you won't want to miss next time when we're going to get into a lot of more things. We'll see you then.